Well, thank you guys all for coming today, and thanks again, Richard, for the introduction. Usually when I do these presentations, particularly on the Civil War, I try to cover like 50 guys in the course of an hour and try to tell all their stories, and oftentimes it's very difficult, sometimes impossible to do, and I often have to leave out stories that I don't want to leave out. But tonight, we're completely dedicated to one guy, so you're going to get to know him pretty in depth. He's a guy with a really incredible story, Samuel Harris, and obviously this whole presentation will go through his whole story. But before we begin on him, I want to, if I could just get a show of hands, has anybody heard of the Civil War book, Company H? Does that ring a bell to anybody? Company H? Okay. If you've ever seen the Civil War documentary by Ken Burns, he uses words from Company H quite a bit. It was a memoir written by a Confederate soldier by the name of Sam Watkins, which that name may ring a bell if you've watched The Civil War by Ken Burns anytime recently. His memoirs were very in-depth. He talked about all the battles that he was at. He had a way with words, a way to kind of describe these battles very vividly. He also exaggerated a little bit with some of the stuff, and when historians look at Company H, they oftentimes will say, yeah, you got to take that with a grain of salt. The reason I am mentioning that is because Samuel Harris's memoirs, though not quite as famous as Company H, Ken Burns didn't use any of Samuel Harris's memoirs, at least not to my knowledge, they are equally as fascinating. They are all digitized online, and if you guys want more info when we're done, feel free to stop by, come up here and chat with me and I can give you the details. But they're a really, really fascinating read, and they go through his entire experiences throughout the Civil War. Much of the content of what I'm presenting to you today comes from his memoirs specifically. And they are very similar to Sam Watkins. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because you do have to kind of take some of what Sam Harris says with a grain of salt. What I'm presenting to you today is mostly exactly the way Sam Harris gave this information. And some of it can be backed up by newspaper articles. Some of it can be backed up by some other primary sources. But there's a lot of it that we don't necessarily know if it's 100% true or if it's just Sam Harris telling a good story. Now, all that being said, much of what I am telling you tonight we can confirm is true. So again, like I said, take it with a grain of salt, but they're good stories nonetheless, and I'll give you some details on his memoirs as we get to the end. So that's a picture there of Sam Harris. Obviously, he's a bit older in that. That's well after the war that picture was taken, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it here. So who was Sam Harris? Sam Harris was born in 1836 in a small town called Hartford, Vermont. That is a picture of Hartford, Vermont right there. It's located roughly in central Vermont along the White River. It's nearby to a slightly larger town called White River Junction. That was a bit like what Pontiac was to Rochester at the time of the Civil War and in the years prior. It was kind of the county seat. It was a bit of a larger town, and this is a little bit of what Hartford looked like. Now, that probably isn't exactly what Hartford looked like when Harris was there. He left for Rochester in 1837. He was only a year old when he left for Rochester, but that's a picture from the late 1800s of Hartford, and you can see it's got the small downtown. It was a mill town, quite like Rochester was. There were a number of mills all over Rochester. Obviously, we had the Clinton River running through it. We had Paint Creek. So there's a number of mills, and Hartford wasn't all that different from that. He was the son of a man by the name of Edward Harris. We're going to talk about him in the next slide. And his mother was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Sanborn Gillette. No relation, at least that I could find, to some of the other Gillettes that also settled in Rochester. But Gillette was a very common name, particularly in New England. They went back to the 1600s in Massachusetts, an early pioneering family. And she was from a very, very military-driven family. Her father and three uncles served in the War of 1812. Her grandfather served in the American Revolution. Two of her grandfather's brothers also served in the American Revolution. These are his graves. These are their graves. in the cemetery in Vermont where they are buried. And it is this one here, Ebenezer Gillette. It actually says Lexington Alarm on it, which I couldn't find too many more details on that, but the Lexington Alarm is, of course, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that sort of initial battle of the American Revolution. So they were very, very involved in the military going all the way back. Let's move on to the next one here. This is Edward Harris. So this was Samuel Harris's father. That's a picture of him right there in the middle. He was an attorney for most of his life, even after coming here. Graduated from Dartmouth University in 1826. Had a very, very successful career as an attorney. And he's an interesting figure. He moves the family here to Rochester in 1837, continues that attorney career, but there's some very interesting things with that as well. He was the Oakland County Circuit Court Commissioner for a time in the 1850s. He was a member of the Oakland County Anti-Slavery Society. In fact, he represented Oakland County at the Michigan State's Anti-Slavery Convention in 1839, which is a pretty unique thing because a lot of those guys that were at that convention were conductors on the Underground Railroad. These are people that hid slaves in their farm buildings. I've never been able to find anything specifically related to Edward Harris and whether or not Edward Harris was related to the Underground Railroad. But there were a couple other guys from Rochester that went with him to the state convention in 1839, a man by the name of Rollin Sprague. If you know the Stone Store in Rochester where the home bakery is, that was his store for a time. Also a man named Uri Adams, who was another incredible story that I could do a whole presentation on. He was another kind of early town settler, town pioneer that got involved with Millerism and ended up forming this sort of fanatical cult, for lack of a better word. But they were all involved with the Oakland County Anti-Slavery Society, including Harris. So we don't know. I'm going to talk about where their houses were and that kind of thing as we go along, but it's entirely possible that Edward Harris hid slaves in some of his buildings. We don't necessarily know that for certain. The picture you see on the left there is what's called the Bradford Academy. That was a school in Bradford, Vermont, which was very near to Hartford, that he helped to found. It was essentially just a school, not all that different from Rochester High School or the academy that was here in Rochester in the mid to early 1800s. And then the picture on the right here is of Salmon Chase. Edward Harris was actually close friends with Salmon Chase. He was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury during the Civil War. That may be a name that you recognize. Samuel Harris, in his memoirs, wrote about an experience that he had. After the Civil War, Samuel lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years. And while he was in Washington, D.C., Samuel Chase actually came in to visit him, knowing that he was friends with his father. And Samuel Harris writes in his memoirs, Chase said there were three of us together most of the time, Jacob M. Colomer, Edward P. Harris, and myself. We were all poor young men trying to work our way through college the best we could. Harris recalled, we were all sitting on shop stools, and Mr. Chase began telling some of the pranks in which both himself and my father were engaged while students. I asked him if he remembered the time they took a jackass up in the second story of one of the buildings and tied him to the door of one of the professor's rooms. Also, when they took a farmer's wagon apart one dark night and put it together on top of the ridgepole of his barn because he would not give them a few apples that were rotting on the ground. He laughed heartily and said it did him good to bring back his boyhood days. So that's just a little glimpse of his memoirs and the way he wrote. Like I said, I'm going to read you a few more snippets like that as we go along today. But Edward Harris there was close friends with Salmon Chase, at least during his college years. All right, the Harrises come to Rochester. So summer 1837, Edward Harris comes here to Rochester. He had actually known a man by the name of Christian Horton in his younger years, and he had kind of befriended Christian Horton. He was another early pioneer. He wrote quite a number of pioneer memoirs in early newspapers and whatnot as well, so he's an interesting figure. He's here for a couple months, and then he sends for his family, who are also in Vermont, and that includes Samuel's older brother, Edward, and Samuel's mother, Elizabeth. They're going to come from Vermont. He doesn't say specifically where they get on a steamer, but they board a steamer called the Missouri. Likely it was in Buffalo or somewhere like that. That was the general area that a lot of that stuff happened. And he came across Lake Erie to Detroit. It was about a 20-day trip getting from Vermont to Detroit, and they settled here in Rochester. Now, one of the interesting things is we actually do have a picture here. Stay in the camera's view. That house that you see right there was the first house that they moved into. To give you an idea where this was the old Lambertson House Hotel. This wasn't even there when they first moved here in 1837. It wasn't built till 1844. But this corner is where Bean and Leaf stands today, right on the corner of Main Street and University. If you were to go down the street, where this house is where the Funky Frog is. It's like a kids resale shop. And then there's also the downtown collaboration studio is on that spot as well. So that was their house. This picture was taken a little closer to the turn of the century. They were only in that house for about a year, and then they moved down to, as Samuel describes it, the brow of the hill. I had reached out to Sam, who's the archivist here at the museum, and a couple other references, and we don't know exactly where that house was located. There's not really any good pictures of it or anything like that. But he does describe in his memoirs, he says it was just north of the old mill, which is this mill right here. This was located right at First and Main Street. Cool old flour mill. So it would have been just the other side of this. That might even be the top of it that you kind of see in there. Today, it's roughly this area. I'm not exactly sure what that building is. I think it might be a lawyer's office or something like that. This building has a number of different businesses in it. If you've ever been to Giorgio's Pizza, that's in there. So the house was likely somewhere along this area, which would have been a hill at that time. The bridge obviously was not there at that time. It was just a dirt road that went down into the valley and kind of came back up. So that was where they actually lived. He was very interested, and we'll talk more about this as well, he was very interested in machining, steam engines, boilers, all that kind of stuff. He was really into tooling, and he made a career out of that later in life. But when he was at the age of 12, in what would have been their second house, he actually built his own steam engine, and people used to come by. He used it to drive a lathe that he would do gun work on. So he would work on people's guns. He would also fix people's sewing machines and that kind of thing. So here's this 12-year-old kid that would actually, offer these services to people. Now, how many customers he got, I don't really know, but he does mention that was a part of it. His wife lives here through the Civil War. In the years after the Civil War, Sam originally ends up going to Washington, D.C., and then he moves out to Chicago. Shortly after that, which we'll talk more in detail about later, his wife Sarah, who he meets here in Rochester, is actually the daughter of a man by the name of Hosea Richardson. Her name was Sarah Richardson. Hosea was the builder of the Rochester Woolen Mill, which was the precursor to the Western Knitting Mills, and of course now it's the Rochester Mills Brewing Company. So there's a connection there with sort of Rochester's early milling history. Over here, that is a picture of Sarah's grave in Mount Avon Cemetery. I just took that one the other day. And then a couple of their children that are buried in there as well. Harris talks about, I'm going to read you just a couple little snippets from one from his memoirs and one from a newspaper. He talks about when Sarah passed away and they brought her back here to Rochester for burial. He says, about the time my wife was taken, he says, this happened about the time my wife was taken sick with tubercular consumption. She suffered a great deal. I procured the services of several of the best physicians in the city, this being Washington, D.C. She lingered until November 2nd, 1871, when death came to her relief. At her request, I took her back to Rochester, Michigan, and laid her beside our little Frances. My mother had come to live with us in the summer of 1869. It was a great comfort to my wife to have mother with her during her long sickness. So he mentions Frances on here. Frances is buried there in Mount Avon as well. She was only 22 months old when she passed away of scarlet fever, but they raised her, for those 22 months here in Rochester as well. In 1909, Harris wrote a bunch of his memoirs about Rochester and about his experiences in Rochester, growing up in Rochester. And those were published in a bunch of different newspaper articles in 1909. And I'm going to read you just a quick snippet from one of them because I think it's super interesting. And he writes, basically in these articles, he writes of kind of what Rochester looked like. And he goes through kind of house by house and who these people were that lived there. And it's a very unique glimpse of kind of what 1830s, 1840s Rochester looked like. So here's just a little snippet of one of them. He says, there was a one-story house on the corner north of the Pavilion Hotel. This was among the first houses built in Rochester. Just north of this house was a large vacant lot, and I remember that during the Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign of 1840, the Whigs built a large log cabin on this lot. They kept a live raccoon on the roof and a barrel of hard cider at the northeast corner with several tin cups so everybody could help themselves. Talk about a sane 4th of July. Way back in the 40s, Mike Gordon and John Barger used to get up and fire off an anvil at 3 o'clock in the morning. In a few minutes, every boy in town would be out firing off firecrackers or a lead cannon he had cast himself. Woodward and Chapin had cast a large cannon and rigged up a lathe and bored it out. Then the boys could make a louder noise. So if you can imagine at 3 a.m., when they say setting off an anvil, does anybody know what that means? Yep. So they'd basically put powder underneath an anvil, blow it up, and it'd shoot up in the sky and make a loud noise. So really just, a fascinating glimpse of kind of just everyday life and celebrations and that kind of thing in Rochester. So I love that one, and the rest of his stories from 1909 are pretty incredible as well. So this is Sam Harris himself. I promise we're going to get into the Civil War stuff in just a minute, but I want to set the foundation. So these are two pictures of Sam Harris. One, obviously, quite a bit later in his life. He was a bit of an older man there. And then one when he was younger. So that younger one that you see there would have been probably what he looked like around the time of the Civil War. As I mentioned, Sam had an obsession with tools and mechanics and steam engines and all that kind of stuff. He was very, very much into that. He made the steam engine when he was 12 years old. He actually patented his own steam engine after the war called the Harris rotary steam engine. And at the age of 16, he actually left Rochester, went back to Vermont, to the town that he had come from, to work at a company called the Latham and Company Locomotive Works. He was working on the railroad there, and he was only there for about a year when that company went out of business. And then he moved to Michigan City, Indiana, for around the same period of time to work in the Michigan Central Railroad's repair yards. This was kind of his thing. He loved working, the railroads. It kind of put all of his interests together. While he was working for the Michigan Central Railroad, he wrote of a particular experience that I made a note of. He says, the engine, named the Bald Eagle, was a very old one and very badly out of repair. We reached Chicago without an accident, but on our way back, in rounding a curve, the engine swung so heavy that she ripped off the flange from her driving wheel, and all 4 driving wheels left the track and ran along the ties. We were going about 60 miles an hour and had 11 passenger coaches all loaded behind us. The engineer was so scared that he forgot to shut off the steam and left his post and ran to the front of the engine where he could jump with less risk. I jumped to his place and shut off the steam, brought the reverse lever to the center, and blew the whistle for brakes, and soon brought the train to a stop. None too soon, as we were just going onto a trestle. I was not injured to any great extent, but was bruised quite badly by being thrown against the levers. The shock and bruising I received laid me up for several days. So after this experience, he kind of goes on to explain how he was bruised up pretty badly from this. He ends up coming back to Rochester for a couple of years to kind of recoup. And then he ends up going out to Milwaukee to work on another railroad out in Milwaukee, where he ends up getting fired, actually, from his job in Milwaukee. He doesn't take the blame for it. He kind of pushes the blame off onto somebody else, but he basically says that whoever this person is was supposed to move a locomotive, and while they were moving this locomotive, they opened up a lever that shot greasy water all over 2 well-to-do Milwaukee women, and they got really upset and complained to the railroad about it, and somehow Sam got fired for this. But I got a feeling Sam had more to do with that than he was willing to admit. So that's a bit of his story. Now let's get into some of the Civil War stuff. So Sam is pretty much credited as being the guy who put together Company A of the 5th Michigan Cavalry Regiment. If you're familiar with the Civil War, you'll recognize the 5th Michigan Cavalry as being one of the regiments that was a part of the famed Michigan Cavalry Brigade. Michigan Cavalry Brigade is originally under the command of a man by the name of Joseph Copeland. Copeland, interestingly enough, he was a Harvard grad. He was a lawyer and then a judge for a period of time before the war. He was kind of one of those political generals, let's put it that way. He ends up getting dismissed just prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, and then George Armstrong Custer takes over that regiment. So when we're talking Michigan Cavalry Brigade, you can think of it as Custer's brigade, and we'll talk more about Samuel Harris's unique experiences with Custer as we go along here as well. But he is a lieutenant in the 5th Michigan Cavalry. He's essentially the founder of this regiment. A man by the name of Wellington Gray, who is helping Joseph Copeland put this regiment together, had known Samuel Harris before the war and had come out to Rochester and say, hey, Sam, you want to help me put this unit together? And Sam said, sure. So the next day, after this guy comes out, Sam goes out to the Pontiac County Fairgrounds. The Oakland County Fair is going on. This is a very cool picture. Use my laser so I'm not off camera here. This is a very interesting picture here. This is Pontiac. This was published. It's a piece of art published in 1867. It's a 3D view of what Pontiac looked like in that time. But this right here, where this circle is, this was like an oval racetrack. That was the fairgrounds that he was talking about. There. He went there and he recruited 117 men from the Oakland County Fair to sign up for Company A. And they were all ready to go within a couple days to head down to Detroit and get ready to go out to the front. So if you can imagine just showing up at a county fair and convincing 117 guys to go off and fight with you within a week, pretty incredible, and it kind of gives you a bit of a hint of what the opinion of the masses were in the country at that period of time. To give you some idea of where we're at in Pontiac here, this is kind of M59 coming into town. This is M59 shooting out the other way, going out towards Waterford and that area. If you're familiar with Oak Hill Cemetery, the cool old historic cemetery in Pontiac, you can see it here on this 3D view as well. Not quite as big here as it is today. Joseph Copeland is actually buried in there, the original former of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, along with a couple other significant Civil War figures. But that's where he kind of forms this unit. Now, there's a very interesting story, and I'll read to you about it as well. He actually gets a horse from some of the locals here in Rochester. They raise some funds, and they buy a horse, and they give him a horse so that he can go off to war with this horse. And in the process of that, he ends up racing this guy, who is a slightly more familiar face. His name is Judson Kilpatrick. He was a pretty well-known Civil War cavalry general during the Civil War. Kilpatrick earned the sort of unwelcome nickname of Kill Cavalry later in the war because he was very reckless. Not all that unlike Custer. He typically took his units into some pretty bad places and ended up in a bad spot more than once. So interesting stories about him, but let me read to you about the horse real quick. So Harris writes in his memoirs, when I went into the Army in 1862, Mr. Jennings called the men of the village together and told them that Sam Harris was the first one to go into the Army as an officer and should make me a present of a good horse. The money was raised, and they bought the brown horse of Jonathan Pixley. The horse was noted as being a very vicious animal. He would bite, strike, and kick, and would run away every time he got the chance. They sent him to me at camp in Detroit by Guy Barger. The first thing I done was to fill my pockets with sugar and gave him. In a very short time, he was a perfect pet and more gentle horse I never knew. He outran every horse in the cavalry corps on a quarter-mile run. I seldom rode him much in action, as I thought too much of him. After I was wounded and captured, he was turned over to one of the men and was killed in action. He goes on to write in another area. This was in a different piece.
He could and did outrun every horse matched against him on a quarter-mile course. There was a man in my company who was a regular horse jockey. Captain Gray bragged about how his horse could beat mine. I told my orderly to beat him, and he did it handsomely, winning quite a sum of money from the captain, which made him very mad. After winning in every race he ran, the horse became well known in the cavalry corps. Finally, Major General Judson Kilpatrick sent down a very bombastic challenge. I told the jockey to take him up and beat the general's horse, but to be sure and not run him over a quarter mile if he did. He did beat him and won quite a sum of money. The general was mad to think his blooded horse could be beat by a scrub, as he called my horse. So this is a pretty cool story. Judson Kilpatrick was no joke. He was one of the top generals in the cavalry corps, and somehow Sam Harris's horse managed to beat him in a race. It's no doubt that him being the general that he was, he had a horse from likely one of the big farms in Kentucky or somewhere else. So that's a really interesting story. Step forward here. Okay, Gettysburg. We were just talking about Gettysburg a little bit earlier, but the Michigan Cavalry Brigade does figure significantly in the fighting at Gettysburg. Has anybody here been to Gettysburg? Yeah, we got a few people that have been. If you've been to Gettysburg, has anybody here ventured over to East Cavalry Field at Gettysburg? Okay, yeah. So East Cavalry Field is a little bit, I shouldn't say off the beaten path because it's only a couple miles down the road, but it's not a part of the main battlefield. Oftentimes it's not included necessarily on the tours and that kind of thing. Unless you ask to go out there, you're probably not going to go out there. But there are some monuments out there. It's almost like sort of a mini version of Gettysburg in its own right. And it was fought kind of just to the east of town. Thus why it's called East Cavalry Field. The main fighting at East Cavalry Field happened on July 3rd, around the same time as Pickett's Charge was taking place on day 3 of the main fighting at Gettysburg. And this map kind of gives you some idea of what the fighting looked like and how the 5th were involved. So you've got Confederate General Jeb Stuart's cavalry up here, and their units. You've got Custer's cavalry and David Gregg's Union cavalry down here. And what's ultimately happening, without getting into too many details, is the Confederates are sort of pushing towards this road right here. This road sort of runs to the east out of town, and if the Union Army was to get pushed back, the main body of the Army was to have to retreat in mad chaos, they would be coming down this road. So what the Confederate cavalry are trying to do is to sort of disrupt this route out of town. As they are doing this, Gregg is sending in these different cavalry units. You've got McIntosh's cavalry here. They're kind of skirmishing with some of the Confederate cavalry up in this area. And as they begin to give way, the 5th Michigan are sent into the fray. The 5th Michigan are one of the few units in the Army that are actually equipped with Spencer repeating rifles. So they're able to fire more than one shot at a time. That's a pretty unique feature of them. Sam Harris likely would have had one of those. They go into this fight. They all end up getting pushed back as well. This map doesn't necessarily show that. But at that time, as they're getting pushed back, is when George Armstrong Custer rides to the front of the 7th Michigan. He actually does it with both the 7th and the 1st at different times. Raises his sword in the air, gives the famous, "Come on, you Wolverines," yell, and charges them into battle. And that one event is kind of what puts Custer on the map. So as far as where Harris's role plays in Gettysburg, obviously he would have been involved in this fighting, but he mentions quite a bit about the battle in his memoirs, and I'm going to read to you a couple of his different experiences here. So before the Battle of Gettysburg on June 28th, actually, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, a couple units, the 5th and 6th Michigan, venture into Gettysburg before the Confederates are even really there, and I'm going to read to you kind of his experience there. He goes, Sunday morning, the 28th of June, we were up early, and after a field breakfast, we started for Gettysburg, which we reached about 1 o'clock p.m., just after the churches were dismissed. The people of Gettysburg were overjoyed to see us, as General Jubal Early, who left as we came in, had laid a levied tribute on the town, saying that if it was not promptly paid, he would burn it that night. General Joseph Copeland was in command of our forces and made his headquarters at the City Hotel, built on the square. Monday morning, after eating a hearty breakfast, most of it cooked by the good ladies of Gettysburg, who without doubt had been up nearly all night cooking for us, we mounted our horses a little after sunrise and went back the same road we had come to Emmitsburg. I shall never forget the good lady of the celebrated Cadore house, for as we passed by, I rode up to the door and asked for a drink of water. She said to me that if I would come in, she would give me something better than water. She brought out a bottle and a large tumbler, saying it was pure old blackberry wine, and she knew it was good, for she made it. She poured out a tumbler full. I don't think any old soldier will say that I was foolish enough to leave any part of it. I stood there a moment chatting with her and her two lovely daughters when she filled up the glass to the brim again. I drank this, and bidding them good day, joined my command. So that's a really interesting story. If you're familiar with the Cadore farm, it is this one that you see pictured up here, the red barn. If you've gone to Gettysburg and you've stood on the field where Pickett's charge has happened, it's a very prominent feature out in the middle of that farm. It is right kind of where Pickett's men all came across that field. During the July 3 fighting, so again, during this East Cavalry field fighting, he mentions, I rode to our battery and passing the rear of the guns found Lieutenant Pennington sitting on his horse about 6 feet to the left of his left gun. I rode up on his left close to him. He turned and saw who it was, said, I'm glad you have come, and remarked that it was rather warm. At this moment he called out, jump. He rolled off his horse on the right. I rolled off my horse on the left. A shell passed by us and buried itself in the ground about 30 feet in the rear of our horses. Instantly, we were both back on our horses, Pennington remarking, it was a rather close call for one of us. A shell or cannonball coming directly towards you can be seen very distinctly. I turned my horse and started towards where the shell had buried itself in the ground. Lieutenant Pennington called out to me and said, where are you going? I answered, I'm going to get that shell and send it home. He said, you come away from it and let it alone. It may explode and kill you. I reluctantly left it buried in the ground, but I intend to go back there and get it if possible and keep it as a memento of that battle. He never mentions again if he went back looking for that shell, so we don't know if he actually did or not. And then the last thing that I wanted to point out real quick here was this farm here. This is what's known as the Rummel Farm. That is on this map somewhere. I don't know where it is. Yeah, there it is, right in the middle. This was where a lot of the heavy fighting on East Cavalry Field took place. He talks about in his memoirs how he fell asleep along the fence line of the Rummel Farm. I don't know if it's this fence line or one of the other ones, but and talks about, he only got about an hour of sleep, and while he was sitting there, Custer and Kilpatrick had kind of come up alongside of them and were discussing what moves they were going to do next and that kind of thing. So interesting story. The Rummel Farm is still there today. It's a very active farm. And you can check it out if you go to Gettysburg. All right, so now let's move on to the story that, actually, let's talk about Custer first. Then we'll talk about Maria Brooke. So, as I mentioned, Custer was the head of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. The 5th Michigan Cavalry Regiment is a part of that brigade, along with the 7th Michigan, the 6th Michigan, and the 1st Michigan. They all make up that particular cavalry brigade. Harris has a couple different experiences with Custer. He meets Custer. He talks about the first time he came across Custer. He said, early in the spring of 1863, we were ordered out on picket duty on what was called the Lawyer's Road, in company with the 6th Michigan Cavalry, both regiments being under command of Colonel George Gray of the 6th. The most of our duty was to guard against raids by Mosby. We had the usual hardships and pleasures of picket duty. We were kept there until the middle of June. During our stay, a very young man with long flaxen hair came to our camp and stayed several days with us, trying to get our officers to petition Governor Austin Blair to appoint him as colonel of our regiment. But we all declined to sign such a petition as we considered him too young. His name was George Armstrong Custer. So that's kind of his first run-in with Custer. And then later, in the weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, the cavalry brigade end up down near Fredericksburg. They end up actually all through kind of that area of Virginia, between Manassas and Fredericksburg. But there is a time that sort of he is holding the picket line at this place. If you've ever visited the Fredericksburg battlefield near Fredericksburg, Virginia, this is one of the sort of significant spots on there. It's referred to as Chatham, sometimes known as the Lacey House. And this is where he has kind of one of his unique encounters with Custer, and I'll let him read it to you as well. He goes, "The next morning about 10 o'clock, George Custer rode down the hill to my headquarters and asked how things were on my line. After giving him a statement of facts, he said he wanted someone to go down to the river with a flag of truce and find out whether General Rosser was there. He said they were classmates at West Point, and if he was in camp near there, he, Custer, would like to go over and have a visit with him. It was not a very safe or easy job, so I told the general I would go down myself. I had no white handkerchief, so he handed me his. I walked up to the river road, holding the handkerchief over my head. A large crowd very soon collected to see what the Yankee wanted. I called for the officer in command of the picket line. When he came, I asked if General Rosser was near there. He said he was likely at his headquarters. I asked him to send for him to come down, that General Custer was close by and would like to come over. In about half an hour, General Rosser rode down to the opposite bank and called to me. I answered that General Custer was back in my camp and would come over if he would like to see him and would guarantee him a safe return. He answered, send him over. An officer was sent down their line to give orders, no firing. I went back and escorted General Custer down to the river and called to General Rosser to send a boat over. He did so. Custer stayed over until about 4 o'clock. I was becoming anxious about him when he returned, saying that he, quote, had a fine time over there. So an interesting story. Fredericksburg is located right on the Rappahannock River. That's the river that he's talking about. The winter of 1862-63, the Union armies are spent on either side of that river right after the sort of devastating battle for the Union anyways at Fredericksburg. During that time, he had made his headquarters in the Lacey House, which is why I have it pictured here. So kind of an interesting story. Custer and Rosser, like it said in his memoirs, were West Point buddies. They were roommates at West Point for a period of time. There are other stories as well of Custer and Rosser meeting each other during the Civil War. So kind of a cool connection of Sam Harris to those two. And if anybody was brave enough to venture over into enemy territory, it was Custer, for better or worse, right? All right. Now, the story with Sam Harris that really puts him on the map is the story of Maria Brooke and what happens after. So I'm going to read you a bit of a lengthier part of Harris's memoirs, but before I do, I want to give you some idea of who Maria Brooke was. Over on the far side there, you can see a picture of Maria Brooke's grave there in Virginia. She was originally born Maria Ashby. If you're familiar with Civil War history, you may recognize that Ashby name, primarily from that guy on the bottom there. His name was Turner Ashby, sometimes referred to as the Black Knight of the Confederacy. He played a significant role in Thomas Stonewall Jackson's 1862 campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. And he just kind of looks like a bad dude, doesn't he? A number of other members of Maria Ashby or Maria Brooke's family also served in the Civil War. She had a brother that was a surgeon with the 7th Virginia Infantry. She had this brother that you see here on this side. His name was Henry Ashby. He was a colonel with the 2nd Tennessee Cavalry. Actually served in brigade and division command later in the war, the Battle of Bentonville in North Carolina. He actually commanded an entire division. Of course, by that time in the war, the Confederates were losing officers left and right, so they needed anybody they could get. And then the grave you see up on the top there, that's the grave of one of Maria Brooke's daughters, and you can see it says there, the baby in the Brooke story, and let me tell you the Brooke story because it's a pretty incredible one, and it leads into another story. So this is all from Harris's memoirs. He says, this is from January 1864. He says, on account of the extreme cold weather the night before, I had ordered reliefs to be sent out every hour. I decided to continue this as long as I was in command. This practically was the same as having the line patrolled every hour by a squad of 10 or 12 men. And looking over the neck, this was the neck in the river, I saw there was a house about in the middle, being about a quarter of a mile from the line. I asked the picket whether he had seen any men about the house. I rode clear across the neck and asked each picket that could see the house, there were 3, the same question. Each one said they had not seen any person moving about. There was smoke coming out of the chimney, so I knew 1 or more persons lived there. Thinking it best to know who it was, I rode back and notified each of the pickets who had a view of the house that I was going out there and to keep a sharp lookout for me, and if they saw anything suspicious, to fire off their guns and alarm the camp. I then rode out to the house, and coming up to the rear of it, putting my horse in the woodshed out of the wind, knocked at the back door. My knock was the first intimation the inmates had that there was any person nearer than the picket line. I heard quite a rustling within. My first thought was that I was trapped. I was always carried a big Navy revolver in my right boot leg. I reached down and drew it out with my thumb on the hammer. Just at this time, a large girl, about 11 or 12 years old, opened the door. I saw that she was crying. This reassured me, and I dropped my revolver back to my boot, the movement being unseen by her. I glanced hurriedly around the room that could be seen through the open door. Just behind the girl was a boy 9 or 10 years old. To the left was a lady sitting, leaning over a few coals in a large fireplace, with a shawl over her shoulders and a little babe in her lap. Her back was toward me. The girl said, "Will you walk in, sir?" Stepping inside, I glanced over the room hurriedly to assure myself there were no rebs about. The girl set a chair by the fireplace to the left of her mother and asked me to have a seat. As I was sitting down, I said to the lady, who had not yet turned her face to me, "Good morning, madam." She turned her face toward me and said, "Good morning, Captain." I saw she was crying very hard, and that she was not over 35 years old, yet she had a careworn and pinched expression on her face. But I could see that she was a refined and educated lady. I said to her, "Madam, you seem to be in trouble here. If you will tell me what it is, I may be able to help you." She burst out crying and could say nothing for a moment. Then, looking toward me, she said, "Captain, we are starving. I have not had a mouthful to eat for 24 hours. We had 1 hardtack apiece yesterday. I had 2 left this morning. I broke them in 2 and gave half of 1 to each of my 4 children." She had 5 children, one being a babe less than 1 year old. Upon hearing this, I jumped up and said, "Madam, I did not come down here to fight women and children, and I won't see you starve to death on my line. You will hear from me very soon." I strode out of the house with my 10-pound cavalry boots with big spurs, a Navy revolver sticking out of my right boot leg, and my big saber dragging on the floor. I likely made as much noise as a drove of cattle. I was soon mounted, and clapping spurs into my horse, was soon at my camp. Just before I came up, the ration wagons had arrived and were unloading. A trusty corporal stood near. I called him to report to me there as soon as possible, with 3 good men mounted. I ordered some other men standing nearby to dump 3 oat sacks. An oat sack held 4 bushels, and to fill one to the brim with hardtack, and another to be filled with soft bread. By this time, the corporal and 3 men reported to me. I had the sack of hardtack put in front of one of the men and the sack of soft bread in the other. I had the empty sack laid in front of the 3rd man, and selecting the largest 4-quarter of beef out of a dozen, had it placed in front of him. I gave the corporal a few things from my tent for Mrs. Brooks, and told to go in the house on the neck and present them to her with my compliments. So he ends up doing this and ends up giving this. These soldiers end up bringing all this food to Maria Brooke, and Maria Brooke is incredibly grateful. Harris goes the next day to check on her, and when he goes to check on her, he actually brings a bottle of whiskey with him and asks her, "Can you make me a whiskey toddy?" He says every good Southern lady knows how to make a whiskey toddy. And Maria Brooke is so grateful for all the food that Sam Harris had provided. Says, "Sure, I'll whip you up one of these." And right as she starts to make it, a couple other officers, superior officers of Sam Harris, come to the door. And they basically say, "You know, you're not supposed to be here. You're outside your lines. You could get written up for this." And Sam Harris says, "Well, I was just having a whiskey toddy. You guys want to come in and have one?" And these 2 guys basically say, "All right, yeah, it's a cold morning, sure, we can turn a blind eye to it." So they do that. They end up leaving. And then Sam Harris goes to check on her actually one more time the following morning. And he writes, I'll read you that. This is a bit of a shorter snippet. He goes, "The next morning, after riding my line and seeing that everything was all right, I rode out to see Mrs. Brooke again and passed a very pleasant hour or more with them. I took out several articles of eatables to them. Among the rest was a part of a codfish. I apologized to her for doing so, saying that I was well aware most Southern ladies almost despise that Yankee dish. She said she had learned to like it while at school in Philadelphia, that she had attended a young ladies' boarding school there for 3 years. Also, that one of her classmates, and part of the time her roommate, was Mrs. Jefferson Davis, then the wife of the President of the Southern Confederacy. She also informed me that her husband was a captain in the rebel army, and that he was then a prisoner in the old Capitol prison, that he was captured by our folks while at home sick. She said he had a relative, a sister, I think, living in Washington. I told her that I would try and get him paroled within the limits of the city of Washington, with the privileges of boarding with his relative. I then bade the family goodbye and rode back to my camp in good time for dinner. So a key thing to note on that, she lived in Philadelphia, and she went to boarding school with Mrs. Jefferson Davis. They were actually roommates. So that's going to come into the story as we go along here. But Maria Brooke is an interesting one, and he obviously helped her out quite a bit, at least in that moment. So let's fast forward to the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid. So only about a month or two after this experience with Maria Brooke, this particular raid is going to take place. It's typically noted as the Dahlgren raid or the Dahlgren affair, you may hear it referred to. And basically it's a raid on Richmond. Judson Kilpatrick actually meets with Abraham Lincoln prior to this raid. And the idea is that there's kind of going to be two parts to it. One is they're going to sneak the cavalry into Richmond, essentially. They've gotten word that Richmond itself isn't overly heavily guarded once you get into town. And of course, it's the winter months, so a lot of the troops are in camps and whatnot. So part of it is to get into Richmond and to liberate the prisons that are in Richmond. There's Libby Prison, which is full of Union officers. There's Belle Isle there. There's a couple other notable prisons there within Richmond itself. That's part of the raid, is to get in there and to liberate these prisons. The other part of it is to capture Jefferson Davis and his cabinet. So Dahlgren's raid takes place in late February, early March 1864. They're going to go in there. They're going to not quite make their way into Richmond, but on the outskirts of Richmond, something is going to happen, and I will read that to you real quick here. He says, after a march of nearly 2 miles brought us to the residence of Mr. Seddon, the rebel Secretary of War. Here the column halted. My company was directly opposite the house and not more than 100 feet from the front porch. It was a large, old-style Virginia mansion with a wide porch across the front and 4 large stone columns. This is it right here. We had been here but a few moments when I heard a noise in the house like the breaking of glass, and at that same time I heard a woman scream. I looked to see that all my men were in rank and saw they were. I then jumped from my horse and ran up onto the porch. Just as I was stepping upon the end of it, a man, one of our men, came out of the door with a double-barrel shotgun and struck it against one of the columns. I hollered to him to stop, but not quick enough. The barrels broke in two and proved to be made of fine wire. I stepped to the door and looked into the house, but did not go in. As I stood looking in the door, Mrs. Seddon came and said to me, "Your men are pillaging my house and breaking my furniture. Won't you stop it?" I said to her, "Madam, they are not my men. If they were, they would come out of there, and I would shoot them. There is Colonel Dahlgren, the commander. Go to him." She ran to the colonel and made her appeal. With what success, I do not know. I immediately went back to my house and mounted. Some of my men went to the barn in the rear of the house and found a fine, full-blooded Kentucky horse and brought him out and gave him to me. It was the most beautiful horse I had ever seen. I put one of my men on it in order to take good care of him as I might need him. As soon we started on the road to Richmond. Well, that's going to come back to bite him too, so remember that story as well. What's going to end up happening, though, is this happens. Mrs. Seddon has this picture in her head of Samuel Harris. That's the officer that was on the scene, the officer that was raiding the house, destroying the stuff within her house, and she wants to get this guy. So we're going to hear more about that in a minute. The other thing, I'm not going to read you his memoirs in the interest of time, but Sam Harris ends up getting wounded in the shoulder during the Dahlgren raid. He gets shot in the shoulder, and ends up getting captured. As a part of that, when he is captured, he is taken into Richmond, and we're going to talk about that here as well. Okay. So when he's taken into Richmond, it said he is taken on a hay wagon. He's brought to right near the Capitol building, he says, which that's the Richmond Capitol there. This is from late 1865. It was a bit of a mess at that period of time near the end of the war. This is where he was actually captured, a place called Old Church Tavern near Mechanicsville. The tavern actually still stands today. And when he's captured, like I said, he's brought on a hay wagon. He is brought there into Richmond, and they are going to hold a drumhead court-martial, basically a court-martial in the field, to hang him. It's not looking real good for poor old Sam Harris. But fortunately, because of his good doings with Maria Brooke, who was a friend of Mrs. Jefferson Davis, he is going to be granted a reprieve. A captain, a Confederate captain, is going to come up to him while he is there in that hay wagon and basically say to him, "Are you Samuel Harris?" Actually, he doesn't say it quite that way. He says, "What's your name?" And Harris says, "Samuel Harris." He says, "What's your unit?" He says, 5th Michigan Cavalry. He says, "Okay, don't worry, you're going to be fine. You are not going to be hung. Everything's going to be okay." Harris writes about how after this incident, this particular Confederate captain just kind of wanders off into the crowd. And he's thinking to himself, okay, first of all, who is this guy? And why is he saying I'm going to be okay when we've got these other Confederate soldiers over here that are saying I'm going to be hung in a minute? Part of the reason for the hanging, this wasn't sort of your normal thing that you would do with a captured officer, but the Dahlgren raid was a very, very significant incident, and it made the Southern troops, and particularly the Southern folks that lived within the city of Richmond, absolutely irate. Part of the reason for that is Ulrich Dahlgren, the leader of this raid, is actually killed in the raid. When he is killed, a schoolboy, a 13-year-old schoolboy, goes up and is going through all of his stuff. Apparently, it was a normal thing to go through people's stuff after they were killed. He starts going through Dahlgren's stuff, and he finds some letters. And in these letters, there is a note from an unspecified individual that basically says, when you get into Richmond, I want you to kill Jefferson Davis, kill his cabinet, and burn Richmond to the ground. This gets published in all the Confederate newspapers. It's exaggerated quite a bit, but as such, they are absolutely mad. The citizenry of Richmond is just super frustrated by this, to the point that after Ulrich Dahlgren's body is kind of buried near where he fell, they dug his body back up and put it on display in one of the train stations in Richmond as kind of a, this is what's going to happen to you if you come after us like this, almost like a medieval, Braveheart kind of thing. So it's a really bad situation, and obviously Harris, of course, he's captured in the middle of this raid, becomes a part of it. So let's fast forward a little bit here. He does end up getting away. He does end up not being set free, but they agree to take him to Libby Prison, which is the sort of most famous prison in Richmond. That is a picture of Libby there. It is primarily used to house Union officers. Because he was wounded, they actually took him to the hospital rooms of this prison, and he was in the hospital rooms for a good period of time before he joined up with the general population. That picture over there, that's Miss Seddon. That's the girl. That's the lady, the wife of the Confederate Secretary of War, that was absolutely irate at Harris for going into her house. So what happens, an interesting story, while he's there, he's thinking he's out of the woods. I mean, obviously he's still recovering from his wound, which there's no certainties with that at the time of the Civil War. But while he's in there, Mrs. Seddon somehow got word that he was in the hospital rooms at Libby, and she goes in there looking for him. So Mrs. Seddon walks in there, and she goes, let me just read you real quick. From his memoirs, he's talking about the doctor. He said, he then explained to me why my wound was so dangerous. He said the ball had laid bare the artery running to my arm, and if the wound did not heal up quickly, it would cause the artery to slough off and weaken it so much that it would burst, and I would bleed to death instantly. He stood over me and directed Mr. Watson how to dress my wound. Not long after the doctor had left me, I had some very unexpected callers, consisting of Mrs. Seddon, the wife of the rebel Secretary of War, accompanied by her daughter, a young lady about 21 years old, and her son, who was about 16 years old. They were led to my cot by the adjutant of the prison. Mrs. Seddon was angry clear, though, and began to abuse me by saying, "You are the officer that ordered my house sacked. You are the one I saw on our porch. You are the one that ordered the men to break up my furniture." I got a chance to say, "No, madam, you are mistaken." She said, "Yes, you are the one, and President Davis has promised me that if I can recognize you as the officer, he would hang you, and I do recognize you as the one." By this time, she had got clear beside herself, and coming closer to my cot, shut her hand and shook it very close to my face and fairly yelled, "You are a chicken thief, a horse thief. You stole my daughter's riding horse." Seddon's daughter said, "Don't, mother, don't talk so. You forget that you are a lady. You forget this is a wounded officer." Mrs. Seddon, turning to her daughter, said, "Let me alone." The young lady answered, "Mother, you must not forget that you are a lady." The daughter actually cried to see her mother act as she did. Seddon, turning to me even more fiercely than before, said, "I recognize you, you scoundrel, as being the officer that ordered the soldiers to sack our house. You are a murderer, for you hung poor Ned." At this time, the daughter spoke up and said, "Mother, I am positive this is not the officer that ordered the men into our house." So interesting story. He goes on kind of more and more to explain that situation, but basically Mrs. Seddon is irate with poor old Sam Harris. She kind of leaves and basically tells Harris, "You are going to be hung. I'm going to make sure of it." So Harris goes on in his memoirs to talk about how he's in there, and he spends the rest of that day thinking, "Oh shoot, I thought I'd escape being hung, but it's not looking like I've actually escaped." Ends up that night goes by, nothing ends up happening. The next day starts to go by, and a handful of Confederate officers come in, primarily some of the heads of Libby Prison, and they come in and they basically walk up to him and they say, "We're not going to hang you, but we want him put in the dungeon." Now, Sam Harris at this point in time, he's got away with words based on his memoirs. He had kind of made friends with the Confederate surgeon that was working in there, and the Confederate surgeon said, "No, you're not. You're leaving him here with me. He's too sick. You put him in the dungeon, it'll be a death sentence." And Harris talks about how thankful he was that that surgeon did that, because the surgeon ultimately saved his life as well. So an interesting story there. He does dodge being hung because of that. After Libby Prison, he ends up in a whole bunch of different prisons kind of across the South. He doesn't end up in Andersonville, which is, of course, the big one, but he does end up in what's called Camp Sorghum. He ends up in a prison in Savannah, Georgia. He ends up kind of finishing his time in prison in Charleston. There's some interesting stories here. He's at the Charleston jail. They're in the jail yard here. That still stands today. This is a picture of what it looks like today. It's like a wedding venue today, interestingly enough. And his memoirs, which I would recommend if you get a chance to read them, they're pretty interesting. He talks about how he was sitting there one day, and at this point in time, later in the war, the Union boats out on the water, they're shelling the town. They're shelling the city, and he said they would see, they would see these shells flying over the jail yard, and they'd try to run and hide, but these are these big, massive shells. And he says if one of them actually landed in the jail yard, there's nothing they would be able to do about it. They'd all be dead. But he didn't. But he does a real good job at kind of describing that. He also describes it once they're exchanged, they make their way through Charleston out to the harbor to get on a boat. And during that experience, he talks about how they stop at this hotel. This is a hotel called the Mills House. It was kind of rebuilt. It's actually still there in Charleston if you go down to Charleston today. But he talks about how all the soldiers that were exchanged kind of went in there and they pretended they were all getting assigned rooms and pretended they were working in the restaurant and all that other stuff. So it's kind of an interesting story. He also mentions that after they get on the boat on the way back to Washington, D.C., after getting freed, they go past Fort Sumter, and he talks about how they all wanted to cheer, but he said all he could sort of muster up was tears, that it kind of brought tears to his eyes after having spent 9 months in these Confederate prisons. So that's kind of his story. He spends most of the rest of the war in hospitals. He doesn't see a lot more action after his time in the prison camps. He was in pretty rough shape after he got out of the prison camps. He spends a few years in Washington, D.C., and then in the 1870s actually moves out to Chicago. And we'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more as well. But in the 1890s, he really kind of becomes interested in this story and figuring out who these people were that helped him and how it all kind of came together. And that's kind of where this story all comes together, is we get kind of a clue as to how it all worked. And what he did was he wrote letters to Verena Howell originally. And he wanted to actually meet with her. Verena Howell is the woman in the middle. That's Mrs. Jefferson Davis. And to get through to her, what he ends up doing is going to Frederick Grant. This is the son of Ulysses S. Grant. That's him over there on the left. Reaches out to Frederick Grant and says, I know you're friends with the Davises, or you at least have an acquaintance with the Davises, which is kind of funny that the Grants and the Davises would become friends after the war. He says, I have this incident. He explains the whole incident to Grant, what happened. Says, is there any way you can put me in touch with Mrs. Jefferson Davis? I would love to try to find out sort of her side of the story. And sure enough, he does. Grant sends a letter to Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis, at this period of time, is in Narragansett Pier, Rhode Island. She spent her summers there later in her life at a hotel, their big hotel called the Rockingham Hotel that was right on the beach. And she says, sure, I'm interested in this story. Let's see what we can do. So Sam Harris ends up going there to the Rockingham Hotel, spending a bit of time with Miss Jefferson Davis, and the whole story kind of comes together. And he asks her, he says, did you know this Mrs. Brooke? He had heard from actually a fellow soldier that Mrs. Brooke is the reason that he was freed. And she said, yeah, sure enough, I did. I went to school with Mrs. Brooke for a period of time. We were roommates, we were friends, and yes, we had gotten a letter from a captain, a Confederate captain that was there at that time that had spoken with Mrs. Brooke, and had essentially passed a letter along all the way up to the Davises from Mrs. Brooke that essentially said, if Lieutenant Harris ever falls into your charge and ever gets captured, not to hang him or not to do anything overwhelmingly bad to him. So this is always the part of the story that's rather interesting, because there's always a lot of question marks to it. But he does a very good job in his memoirs to kind of explain his experiences with Mrs. Davis. And then sort of the thing to top it all off is he ends up writing to a number of individuals in and near Germania Ford. Germania Ford was near the area where Mrs. Brooke lived, to try to get in touch with the Brookes. And sure enough, he does. He actually gets a hold of one of the young daughters that was there at that time. Obviously, she's an older woman at this point in time. And she writes a letter to him, and I'll read that to you real quick. It says, Gloucester, Virginia, June 5th, 1895. Mr. Samuel Harris, I am in receipt of a letter from Dr. John C. Wise, enclosing your letter to him. I waited before answering to see my brother, but he, like myself, could only remember that a kind officer sent us food when we were starving. As you mention everything so accurately, there is no doubt in my mind about you being the kind officer who sent us beef and bread at the time we so much needed it. And had my dear mother lived, she could have told us so much that we wished to know. But she has been in heaven for 8 years. My brother soon followed her, and the rest of the children hardly know anything of the war. I feel satisfied that you must be the officer who fed and was kind to us, and will always feel grateful. And should you visit our state, would be truly glad to meet and entertain you or any of your family. Soon after your kindness to us, I was sent away to school and did not return home until after the war ended. The next year, we moved from the county, and I have never been back to the scene of our trials. With sincere gratitude for your past kindness to myself and family, and best wishes for yourself, wife, and children, yours most sincerely, Mrs. A.P. Davies. It's actually Davies, I-E-S, no relation to Jefferson Davis. But that's her grave. This is the woman who sent the letter to Samuel Harris. So it's really just an interesting story. That was obviously one of the young girls that was there. This is where she's buried, is in this churchyard here. And this is kind of where it just all comes together. He does a ton of research at the end of the war. After the war, like I said, he ends up moving to Chicago. He opens a tool and machining company called Samuel Harris and Company. There's an advertisement from one of his catalogs. This is actually a Samuel Harris. If you can barely see it, it's kind of faded, but it says Samuel Harris on there, one of his wrenches. And he's very successful. This actually outlives him. He ends up dying in 1920 and is buried in Chicago. He ended up remarrying and living out there. But he had a very successful career. This company goes at least until into the 1940s. I don't know when it actually ended, but well beyond his time. And then, interestingly enough, I wanted to include this. He doesn't mention ever visiting this place, but Libby Prison, where he was imprisoned, and the kind of scene of a lot of his trials, ends up moving to Chicago in 1889. It is bought by a very wealthy individual. He moves it there, builds this big museum. They call it the Libby Prison War Museum, and it's there. They rebuild it all brick by brick in Chicago, where he's living at that period of time. Like I said, I don't know if he ever visited it, but knowing Sam Harris and the way he is, there's a very good chance he went to visit there. There's some really cool pictures online of the inside of this building as well, and the way they just kind of had stuff all over the place, American flags and Confederate flags and all kinds of artifacts just thrown everywhere. So interesting story there. He comes back to Rochester quite a bit, even though he doesn't have a lot of connections to Rochester, at least from a familial perspective. He comes back almost every year from the 1870s all the way until his death for reunions. The Company A of the 5th Michigan Cavalry would have reunions every year. Oftentimes they were in Rochester, but they were always somewhere in this general vicinity. You see them a lot in Rochester, you see them a lot in Romeo, you see a few of them in Pontiac. Where all these guys were from, and Sam Harris was one of the significant figures in the reunion organizations, particularly that Company A organization. In 1917, he donates this monument to Rochester. It is the Samuel Harris Fountain. If you go down near the police station, kind of right next to the parking lot near the municipal park, you can still see it today. It is still there on display. It was originally located at 4th and Main, and then it ended up kind of getting moved all over the place as traffic started to come into town and more cars came into town. They moved it over to Walnut here. This was on Walnut and 4th. This is the old Baptist church. Today it's the Roxy, if you're familiar. So it was right in the middle of the road there between the Roxy and the Rochester Corner Bar, which would have been over there, or is over there today. Wouldn't have been there then, obviously. It ended up in front of the American Legion Hall, which was located on University at that period of time. It ended up in Mount Avon Cemetery. I think in 1980 it moved to Mount Avon, and then eventually landed itself here by the police station. So it's been all over the place, but kind of a unique connection to Harris that still exists. And then this is my last slide. This is an interesting one. This is more related to myself. I was going through eBay, and I was looking up just kind of random historical things on eBay, because sometimes I like to do that because you never know what you'll find. And I happened to stumble upon this letter. I was searching for Rochester, Michigan history stuff, and sure enough, I came across this letter. I ended up purchasing this letter, and wouldn't you know it, it is a letter that was written in 1854 by Edward W. Harris. This was Samuel's brother, Edward's, the older Edward's son. It was addressed from Rochester, likely written in that house right on Main Street at that period of time. It's got some really interesting kind of notes in it. He writes in there, he was a lawyer too, he writes in there, "Sometimes I wish myself down east again, and I often think that it would be much more pleasant carrying out the system, as we termed it, in the halls of the old State and National than it is away off here in the land of Wolverines. And yet, on the whole, I believe that this is the best part of the world, perhaps because it is home." And then just to finish this presentation up, some interesting words that I wanted to kind of give you from Sam Harris that was in his memoirs. And I guess they're kind of words to live by, so to speak. He says, "I had been in rebel prisons 9 months and 8 days, during which time I had passed through more trials and escapes than is the general lot of a soldier. I think I owe my life to my cheerful disposition, being hopeful and looking on the bright side. Many is the time, if I had given up hope, I would have died. I resolutely put all such feelings far away from me and said, I will live to get home, and I did. An overruling providence had raised up friends to me from among my enemies that came to my aid several times at the right moment, and thus had preserved my life. So he's an interesting figure. That's about where we're going to finish it up. If you are interested in his memoirs, I highly recommend you go look them up. They're like 150 to 200 pages, and he goes into a lot more detail specifically about the Civil War, but about the rest of his life as well. He's a fascinating figure, and it's called The Personal Reminiscences of Samuel Harris. You go Google it, you can find it. It's out on Hatha-Trust. It's out on the Library of Congress's website as well. All digitized. You don't even have to buy a book. You can buy copies of it online as well if you want to. Pat actually has some interesting snippets. The museum sells these little books. It's actually a part of his memoirs. It's two little snippets of his memoirs. One is called The Michigan Brigade of Cavalry at the Battle of Gettysburg, and the other one is called Why I Was Not Hung. And it kind of keys in on those two particular stories associated with Sam Harris. So if you're interested, Pat can kind of facilitate selling those. The interesting thing about this, we were just looking at these prior to this presentation, is all of these, if you go find like the original copies of these little books, you can find some of them online. They're all stamped with Samuel Harrison Company, his tool company. So it's almost like he divided up his memoirs into these little stories, and I don't know if he gave them away or he sold them or he made it a part of his stuff that you could buy with the tool company, but it's kind of an interesting story. So those are available if anybody's interested, and that's about where I'll wrap it up. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. Anybody